You're listening to This Election, where we are committed to the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. This is episode number 9. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast series offers a new way of looking at politics, one that focuses on how we engage with others rather than on our partisan identities or policy preferences. It explores why politics is so triggering and offers spiritual practices that heal past wounds, ground us in our bodies, and connect us to that which transcends our differences. If you are committed to active citizenship but feel worn down by a political culture of fear and anger, this podcast is for you. If you have turned off the news or avoided political conversations because it's just too much, this podcast is for you. If you have lost sleep over politics or your temper or a friend, this podcast is for you. Politics is stressful, but it's possible to engage from a place of groundedness rather than from a place of reactivity. It won't be easy. It will take practice, but my hope is that the conversations here open us up individually and collectively to a new way of engaging. This election, we will do politics differently. Our guest today is Laura Martin. Laura is a poet, theologian, and pastor. She's the author of Breaking Into Light, a collection of poems that invite us into the contradictions of life and love. They invite us to break, not apart into fragmentation, but into light. Laura serves as an associate pastor at Rock Spring Congregational United Church of Christ, where she focuses on social action and pastoral care. She currently serves on the board of the Alliance for Housing Solutions and on the steering committees of Interfaith Power and Light and Arlington Interfaith Network. She previously served as the director of programs for chronically homeless individuals at New Hope Housing and as director of the Patrick Henry Family Shelter and housing programs at Shelter House. Laura's bio speaks of deep commitment to social justice, but also a deep love of life. The leading line in the bio on her book cover is that she got married in May because it was peony season. It mentions her golden doodle, Finn, who once won a highest jumping contest. And her online bio starts with blackberries and a front porch overlooking the mountains of Southwest Virginia. In her poetry, you can almost taste the blackberries, and you can certainly hear the katydids. Her words invite us to relish in that goodness, to linger there, but they also invite us to see and name what is broken. Laura gave me a copy of her book just as I was beginning to conceptualize this podcast. The images in her poems helped me breathe more deeply and to notice the beauty in the small moments all around me. Her poems also made me cry as they took me back to moments in our nation that broke my heart. The murder of George Floyd, the shooting at Uvalde, January 6th, the ravages of COVID. It's a small book, but it holds space for all those things and for the sunlight and blackberries. It does what we must all do if we are to hold on to our hope. We must look at all that devastates, all that breaks, and proclaim the greatest still is always love. Laura, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's an honor to be with you and have this conversation together, Katie.
Thank you. So one of the goals of the podcast is to really redefine politics, to go beyond our partisanship and our policy preferences, to talk about the way we engage each other. And so keeping that definition in mind, can you share an early political memory and what it taught you about how we engage?
I actually grew up in a household where we did a lot of political work. My father was a campaign manager, and he taught me from a very early age that we would vote our values, and he taught me to understand politics as a way of helping people and a way of responding to needs that we would see around us. And so when I was 7 years old, I gave my first political speech. I introduced someone who was a candidate for the Virginia Senate. And I remember just being prepared for that speech, that it was about not only the world that was, but the world that we hoped for. And that's what we were encouraging people to vote for and to work for in their lives.
That's amazing. So you're giving a speech at 7 years old, but also just that politics is about what is now and also what can be. I think sometimes when we're just in the what is now, it can be really hard to hold on to hope because what is now is hard sometimes. But when it's combined with what can be, you can feel the hope blossoming a little bit. So the other two pillars of the project are trauma and spirituality. Trauma, because politics wounds us, and we have to acknowledge that before we can fully engage. But also spirituality, because it can help us move through that woundedness to a place of centering and groundedness, where then we can begin to engage with hope. And so today's conversation, we're going to be talking about poetry as a spiritual practice that can both heal and inspire us. And we'll be using your poems to kind of go through this healing journey. And so I want to start with the hard, which is the trauma that is around us and the importance of seeing and naming that. Could you start us out by reading For You Know? It's on page 21.
For you know. For you know Emmett Till, Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. For you know the open casket, stand your ground, selling cigarettes. Officer, I can't breathe. For you know the future executed, with witnesses present, and the hope that has no pulse. For you know betrayal and silence, it will stand up in court, look away. For you know Black mothers beside graves, lament the rose that is cut just to die.
I feel like it's a hard one every time, and it gives me chills, and it makes my heart hurt. But one of the lines that sticks with me, and why I wanted to start here, is the line of look away. So often we want to look away from these things.
Right.
And the poem is saying, we can't. Don't look away. Watch. Can you talk to me a little bit about how poetry stops us from looking away and helps us see?
I think part of the power of poetry is that it can invite us into these really intimate moments in a way that statistics and graphs and charts can't always do. It invites us to be there, like literally standing next to the coffin as the Black mother is weeping for her son who was publicly executed, and the executioner was set free. And so poetry lets us witness with the same intimacy that I think is really the heart of our faith and the heart of our call in this life, to be aware, to be awake, to notice, to stay with what is hard for a beat more than we would want to, and to listen to that and to let those feelings there then be instructive to us for what we do next. If we were to read the newspaper cover to cover and absorb all of that, we would feel emotionally exhausted, but we hadn't actually done anything. And the hope is with poetry that we will have an emotional response that then might appear in our lives in some way as well.
It really makes it concrete, right? It's inviting you into, like you said, an intimate experience and a tactile experience in many ways that does push us to action. So I think grief is present in the poem you just read. We're there with the mom. We are in the lament. And I think that heartbreak is part of healing and also part of political action. And so I want to next explore how poetry invites us to grieve. Can you read from The First Grief, which is page 50?
From First Grief. In my first real grief, I wanted to flee. I wanted to go west from its east, go south from its north. I wanted to take the shortest route pointing away. Now there are times I stop in a full downpour and the desert that gives us water too. Now there are the times that I feel the drenching, and I know that is all another way that love calls for us.
Love the imagery there, grief as desert and grief as a drenching. And also this instinct at the beginning of the poem that you capture of the desire to flee grief. Can you talk about why we want to flee grief and how poetry invites us to be drenched?
Yes, absolutely. I write from my own experience. So my father and grandmother died within 2 months of each other in 2015. And my father died suddenly. And I remember my mother called me and told me, and I literally said to her, no, that can't be. I hung up the phone. I was at the gym running and was like, let me just keep running. Like it wouldn't be true, right? If I could just run or get to a certain point. I think we have this instinctive desire to block out what is so hard and what doesn't align with how we conceive that life is supposed to be. And I was in a place of real numbness for days after that. The next day, I actually facilitated a retreat, and I only told our senior pastor, but I didn't tell anybody because I was in this state of shock and numbness, which was protective. I understand why I went there. But then all of that broke. We can only hold on to that for so long. And now I've had people say things like, losing a parent is like being in a club you never wanted to join. And you see how that drenching, that these poignant moments or these memories or these times of grief that we feel both connects us with the person we love, who we miss, and it also connects us with everybody else who's experienced grief or loss as well. Because the worst thing to do is to just isolate ourselves and have a singular experience of grief.
I think that's interesting because it speaks to your last line about love calling to us. And it speaks to the love of the person that we've lost, the love that comes from whatever it is that's been taken away from us. And that could be a personal loss or something political about what our society is doing.
Right.
That there's love there. But your reflections that the drenching also brought you into community with other people who had experienced similar loss, and the love you find in that community. I hadn't thought about that, and that's really profound, I think.
Yes, and I also think that the capital L love there is meant to indicate this love that is stronger than death, which is also something that I experienced. My father died almost 10 years ago, but yet I see something, I hear a song, something reminds me of him, and I'm right back there. There was no distance at all. And I think when we can carry on something that was good about the person we remember, who we've lost on earth, when we can live out some of their greatest values, that's another way of us standing up and saying love is stronger than death as we bear witness to these values in our life.
What do you think that looks like in the political space when our griefs are not personal, but when our griefs are also political? What does it mean then to believe in that capital L love?
I think it means allowing ourselves to do something with that, to hold that grief in our arms and say, I am grieving how my immigrant siblings feel right now. And so I'm going to show up and be with them. And I don't know what it looks like for every person. Your own way of being in response or in community is going to look different at different times, situations. It might mean I'm going to pull out my tortilla maker, make tortillas, and go serve people doing day labor jobs. It might mean I'm going to provide childcare during an ESL class. It might mean I am going to compose a song about my values. So we just let ourselves hold that grief and listen to it and follow its invitation to go deeper into the love that is intertwined with that grief as well.
So this is a good segue to my next question, which is something that I find in the poems in your book is this ability to hold grief and sadness and brokenness, but also hope and beauty at the same time, which I then think invites us to learn how to do that in our lives. And so I would love if you could read these stories too. It's on page 22. And interestingly, it is the poem right after the For You Know poem that we began with. And so if you're reading Laura's book, you're in this moment of grief next to the grieving mother, next to the casket. And then these are the next images that she invites you into.
These stories too. When you tell the stories of this war, tell these too. Tell of those who stand under broken skies and play music. Tell of the women who will not leave because cats cry for food on the streets near them. Tell of the zookeeper who sleeps next to his elephant, saying calm words when days tear apart. Tell of those who take what scant food they have and break it to share. Tell of those who know that grace is real, not from rumor of it, but from encounter with it.
One of the things that I learned when I was running the shelter was that there is always light and there is always grace, even in the darkest places. But we don't always have the ability to see it. And sometimes, even when we see it, we don't have the capacity to receive it and to let it change us. And so we have to cultivate both an ability to see and an ability to open to that light and let it shift things. The way you use grace in this poem reminds me of that. I wonder how poetry can help us not only see light and see grace, but actually open ourselves up to it as well.
It's a beautiful question. I think poetry invites us to pay attention. One of my own personal spiritual practices that is so important is practicing the examen, which is an ancient practice developed by Ignatius of Loyola. Modern interpretations of that invite you quite simply to close your eyes and to go through and to think about in the past day, what were some moments of disconnection or pain or grief that I felt, to acknowledge those and to just lift them up to God with a sense of release. And then the examen invites us to turn and to think from there, what were some times that I felt joy or connection or noticed the presence of God? And through doing that, as I would have this habit of closing my eyes, picturing the day, I would see the face of somebody who was taking a ripe strawberry and eating it and smiling. And these pieces that I otherwise might have missed, noticing the person who held the door open for somebody whose arms were full. And just being awake and aware, the observance of these moments gets reflected in poetry. Again, it allows us to truly zoom in.
To zoom in on both, right? Like you're talking about the examen
Exactly.
Is both acknowledging the pain, just zoom in there and have the intimacy that we talked about just a bit ago next to the mom, but then also the intimacy of tasting that strawberry. And so you get both. You get the pain and you get the juiciness of the beauty too.
Yes.
So the second section of your book, and where a lot of the poems that we are reading today, is called Justice Denied, Justice Pursued, Lament and Calls to Action. And one of the things I think about pursuing justice is that the pursuit of justice is multi-generational work, and that we don't always get to see what comes from the efforts that we are putting in to change things. And so keeping that in mind, could you read What Rises for us? It is on page 28.
What rises? All things rise again. I know that this is somehow true, and I do not need to understand the physics to believe it. Seeds in the ground, the last moon of summer, the prayer you whispered when there was no one else in the room. So pitch yourself toward what will not be finished in the visible world. Work for the seeds in the ground and the birds that cannot yet fly. Work for the home of the ones not yet born, and the ones whose bare feet have touched earth for 100 years. Work for which you thought you had lost, and for what will not go unnoticed by eyes other than your own.
In that poem, you mentioned those who have not yet been born, and you mentioned those whose feet have been touching the ground for 100 years, which is what made me think about this question of the multi-generational nature of a lot of what we're doing in trying to make a better world. I think that requires a different understanding of time. And so I was wondering how you, as a poet, conceptualize time and how it invites us as readers of poetry into a different understanding of time.
I think that one of my influences is the indigenous idea that whenever you're making a life choice, you should think about how it will impact 7 generations to come, and what that's inviting us into, the imagining forward in that way. I also think about Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote about heaven and hell and ideas of them being experienced in time. In other words, if somebody were to have gone through abuse and then they perpetuate that abuse to somebody else, that would be an experience of hell. But also, if somebody were to go through that experience of abuse and then say, it stops here, I'm creating something else, that is an expression of heaven. So he thinks of them as occurring through existence, to not see a separation in that, but to see a continuity and an invitation in the heaven and right now in time.
The practice of imagining 7 generations from now and where our lives might flow into that, I think is really beautiful. Sometimes poetry feels like this snapshot, right? Like the images you were just reading are very concrete images. The last moon of summer, the whispered prayer in a room where no one thinks you're there. Those are moments in time, and yet they're also beyond time too, right? And so you're both deeply present and also connected to infinite time, right? Like forward and backwards probably as well.
Yes, exactly.
So one of the main claims of this project is that we have to do inner work in order to be in a place where we can actually engage in the outer work of healing. It's a theme that you explore in a lot of your poems as well. And so I'd like us to walk into that space with your poem, Living Close, which is on page 12.
Living close. The world is too often charged by fear and will disappoint you again and again. Know this and go on anyway, refusing to concede the good and the possible. Let the voices of analysts keep silent today and listen to the wisdom of rivers and trees instead. There will be time for undoing and redoing, but right now live close up to what and who you love. Choose the book or the song or the apples baking. Cheers the sun coming through the window, the dog completely satisfied as he sleeps, the face of the person you love near you, the letter you will finish writing. Go back to the place where you found honey coming from rocks and take someone there with you.
Can you talk about how living close, which was the title of that poem, helps us with the undoing and the redoing that must be done?
Absolutely. And just reading this again, so close to the election, I hear it in a new way and with more urgency. Because the urgency is not to turn on the TV and listen to the latest predictions. The urgency is not to follow the latest polls. But the urgency is to center ourselves and to come from a place of groundedness where we know that our soul is with us and that we can be as whole and complete as possible to live in these days. And so the practice of, again, you talked about the internal, like saying, how do I need to start my morning? How can I start it? Paying attention, whether that's through the examine, whether it's through a walk of noticing, whether it's through meditation, silence, being with your dog. How is it that you can start from that place of groundedness where you haven't given yourself away to cable news pundits before it's even 9 a.m.? And then you start from this place of fullness versus a place of lack. And you can operate from that, and you can better hear then how it is that you are called to move and be and respond and notice in the world, because you're not entering into each day with your head already filled with someone else's words, with somebody else's worries, with somebody else's predictions. But you can listen to the holy within you better.
When you start with the news, it's already pulling you in all of these different ways, right? Every story is pulling you. If we enter in there first, we almost start scattered. Like we start with our hearts in a million places. Where if we start in a more centered way, we can then still take in that information eventually, if we need to.
Yes.
But we don't necessarily leave with it then. It doesn't take a piece of us away unless we decide we want to go with it. And I think this goes back to another pillar of the project, which is that spiritual practices matter. Doing these things, practicing and doing them over and over again and getting the muscle memory can then help for when we do hear something that's devastating, or when we do hear something that we should be reacting to. We're ready for that, as opposed to thinking, oh, it's one of a billion things that are pulling me apart.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. And it's like you said, it's not that we don't follow what's happening in the world. We absolutely do. But we're following it with a rhythm and a cadence and a responsiveness that doesn't paralyze or overwhelm us, but that invites us to take it in empathy and to respond in some way in empathy to what we have heard.
And that we can do it so much better if we've grounded ourselves first.
Exactly.
So sometimes finding the strength and the courage to act is really hard, especially when we're afraid, especially when we're grieving. And so I was wondering if you could read All in the World, which is page 51, and begins to get at how we move forward.
All in the word. For all that is in the world that devastates you, there is also this. The dog who leans his body against yours and exhales. The way that katydids make sounds on summer nights by raising their wings. The way that the basil grows strong and green. The way that we too have strength. Yes, you do. And attention and the choice to mark what matters to us.
The way that we too have strength and attention and the choice to mark what matters to us. I love how in the midst of that, you put the parenthetical, yes, you do. Because so often I think when we read the we of poetry and of literature, and we read about strength and courage, we often think then somebody else has that strength, but not me, because I'm heartbroken or I'm scared. Can you talk a little bit about how poetry can help us find our strength and also our agency, our ability to pay attention and to choose and to mark what matters to us?
Yes, I think the poetry helps us redefine what strength is. So many times people are held up as they were strong because they were stoic. They didn't show any emotion. And that's not at all my sense of what it is to be strong. In fact, I think many times it's people who are taking the strength from experiences that have torn them apart. That is what propels them. I think about people who have lost children to gun violence, for example, who then use that as the legacy for their life's work to try to stop those cycles of violence or to try to change access to weapons. And so poetry invites us to think about strength as the ability to take deep emotions and to use them to move out of things that isolate us into ways that these emotions can connect us. And that then we do get to pay attention to the blossom that wasn't there last week that is there now, to the way that her hands in the summer can smell like a ripe tomato, and to share and to move from that. We keep coming back to this theme of the poetry inviting us to be close up, to not just deal with abstractions, but to really notice the world, which certainly is a practice that Mary Oliver, who's been fundamentally influential on me, had in her life. She talked about paying attention, but that if you pay attention without empathy, it's a kind of reporting that's a field guide. But we need to pay attention with empathy. And that's what makes the difference. So that's the kind of strength that I'm inviting us into here. And that's why I felt like it's important to name. You do have strength. The very thing that breaks your heart open is also a source of your strength in the world, not something you need to apologize for.
As someone who is very empathetic and deep feeling, and who doesn't always feel like that feels like strength in my body, I really appreciate that reflection. And also, I think it invites me to think about the ways in which those moments of trembling sometimes, like how those have invited me into deeper community and to take action that I might not have taken had I not trembled.
You know? Right.
So you and I are both in the DC area, and so we are in the midst of a culture that is really, a lot of people are working really hard to try and make things better. And there's also a lot of emphasis around understanding things at an intellectual level and measuring things and what does it mean to be effective and evidence-based. And I think in politics, even beyond the Beltway, there is a tendency to measure effectiveness with outcomes, right? So to talk about, did our candidate win? Do the policies we care about get enacted? And those things are really important, but they're not everything. And you have a really beautiful poem that I'd love you to share. It's on page 14. It's called Counting. Do you mind reading that one?
Counting. To count your life, count it by the single hour. When you watch your work across years come together, and understood then what it meant to strive. Count it by the small hand you held when she did something brave, and the way you remembered that you were brave too, if only sometimes. Count it by the honeysuckle you found and told no one about, and count it by the secrets that you spoke when silence needed to break. Count it by what you were handed down and work to undo before it undid you. Count it by the berries you ate when they tasted of the sunlight that made them. Count it by the way you learned that you too were made through light and fell asleep smiling in the dark.
What does this poem and poetry more generally speak into this culture of effectiveness and outcome as a way to measure our efforts?
It's meant to be a place of grace. One of the prayers that has really landed on my heart this season is the Womanist translation of the Jesus Prayer or the Lord's Prayer by Yolanda Norton. And she talks in it about giving grace to our own limits and the limits of others. And so many times we're marked by achievements and metrics. And what really counts is who's there in the hospital room when it's the last day of somebody's life. Or who has told this 9-year-old something so she can feel differently about her body when she and so many others already at age 9 are being taught that their body has to be or perform or look a certain way. How are we measuring what really counts? And of course, all of this is ironic because it's counting, but it's asking us to experience these things that are ineffable, that can't be measured. The value of being seen, heard, affirmed, loved, accepted without having to earn or work for grace or fall in or out of it. It's something that is stronger and deeper than any election. Whatever ends up happening in November, we're going to have the choice. Will we hold somebody's hand as she's walking across the road? Will we cheer for somebody who has made her first soccer goal, or who says, actually, I don't think I do want to take dance classes. I think I want to do watercolor instead. And that we let people, including ourselves, be honest and realize that we're not given these report cards in life that are going to grade us on these externals, but that we have the opportunity to invest in all of these kinds of things described here and beyond.
Listening to you brings me back to where we started, which was this idea of how we engage matters, right? So a lot of us really care deeply about the outcome of the election, and that matters. But what also matters is how we treat people while we're trying to create the world we're hoping to bring into being. And that is true. It's going to be true from now until November, and it's going to be true after November too.
Yes.
And you speak also of lots of things that are not political, or not normally conceived of as being
Right.
political, but they still are, because they're how we treat people and they're how we create community. And so when we choose to support a child that wants to do something different, that is leaning into a future and a community, and it's leaning into hope. And I think that this poem invites us to move beyond the way we track politics, to move beyond the polls.
Yes.
To say, like, how do we connect with each other? Because that is what matters. And that is true for how we treat the child and how we treat the neighbor whose politics we do not understand.
It absolutely is. And you saying this reminds me, in college, I was involved in a political group. And we invited a different political group to join with us on a blood drive. And that was something that we could do together, because blood donors are needed, and it doesn't matter who you're voting for, what issues are important to you. What matters is that somebody needed your blood donation, and one blood donation can save 6 lives. There are so many things that we can agree on, and were we invited to count some of those and to live in some of those. And chances are, whoever we vote for, we believe that people who are hungry should be fed. So we have ways we can show up, whatever happens in November, and feed people who are hungry and donate blood and pay attention and be present for each other and make people going through grief casseroles.
Many of your poems explore the nature of the divine. We talked about, when we talked about the L was capitalized in one of the earlier poems. But some of the other words that you capitalized throughout the book are silence, grace, brave, resurrection, light, grief, and beauty. How does poetry expand our understanding of the divine? And why is that needed for both individual and collective healing?
So poetry expands our idea of the divine, because I think just as we are not one thing, right? Your name is always Katie, but the Katie you will be, or how you will show up in the world, will depend on so many things. And I think similarly, the way we might experience the divine, the mystery, that which some of us call God, can change and evolve and have currents and come back again. And maybe an old term is new to us and we go back. So we need to honor that there's not one static thing. I personally have never held on to this idea of this fixable, unchanging divine, but very much this idea, like Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about, God is the most moved mover, this empathic God. So ideas of that, and when I capitalize, like capital S silence, how do we have that capital S silence in our lives so that we can listen to the very deepest rootedness inside of ourselves? Because that may be how we need to experience the divine when the world is so full of noise. And in other days, when we feel like we can't see anything because everything around us is so dark, we might need to experience the divine as capital L, light. And so it lets us, through poetry and through many people's interpretations, just like if you said, draw a picture of a tree, and we all had different drawings that illustrated the tree, so it can be too with our experience of the divine. I know that was the first part of your question, and then could you remind me of the second part?
Was how an expansive definition of the divine, or even I would maybe use the verb expanding as one that is actually shifting and changing. How does that help us heal individually and collectively?
We're not bound to somebody else's idea of who the divine was or is for us. Just as different clothes fit us in different parts of life, I think the same can be true. And so for us to be healed, In this way, we need to find our terms and our ways through faith that fit us, that feel right, and that let us stand with some wholeness and integrity, because that's what it should be about. It shouldn't be this experience of the divine that makes us feel limited or judged or stuck in mud, but that we can join in this sense of flow and evolution too, because our lives will change in ways we can't even predict. And so might we invite our experience of the divine to be a part of that current as well. And then the fact that we're operating from a genuine place where we can speak to what is true for us, for the experience of today, is its own kind of healing, because we acknowledge that so many people have also experienced religious trauma, or a sense of a God who watches to judge and to punish or to restrict. And this is an invitation to another kind of holy relationship.
Just this image of flow and of current is what really stands out to me in your answer there. And I think that's part of the healing journey, right? That we're changing, we're evolving, we're shedding things. I think both individually and collectively as we seek to heal our world too. And that as we change, our understanding of God may change too, and allowing that growth and allowing some of the questions that come with it, and also allowing ourselves to see differently can help us trust that the healing is okay, even when it feels really uncomfortable.
Absolutely, yes.
So your poems are deeply influenced by Christian scripture and Christian tradition. And I know from our previous conversations that you find a lot of inspiration there. And for me, meditating on scripture is one of my spiritual practices. It's how I begin my mornings, and it's given me a lot of strength and hope. Can you talk about how we enter into sacred text? And that text could be the scripture from our religious traditions, or it could be poetry, it could be literature, it could be so many different things. If we're approaching text as a way to connect with the divine, as sacred, how do we approach it in a way that opens us up to that?
There are a multitude of ways to do that. I would offer just a couple of options for it. One will be to, in the spirit of Lectio Divina, kind of this holy reading, holy listening approach to whatever the text is that you're looking at, be it scripture, poetry, something else, to have a small section, to read it through once, and then to just pause and be quiet, and then to read it through again. And you might decide to read it out loud if that works for you. And then on the second reading, notice what spoke to you in that. Is there a word, a phrase, an image? What did you connect with? I invite you to just sit with what came out and then read it for a third time. And just settle in. You've heard the word or the phrase or the image that came to you. And you're creating some intentional space to let that rest inside of you. And maybe then that will be a prompt for you. It could be something very emotional, like you realize that you've been carrying responsibility for someone else's life in an outsized kind of way. And so through your practice of this holy reading, you have realized you want to let that go. Or maybe it's a theme around forgiveness that's coming up for you. Or maybe what you saw was yourself running on the beach, and you realized you just need to make some time to go and be in the ocean because that's what your soul is seeking. And I think the practice of holy and intentional reading invites us to do that. Some people might also want to set up a space for that, whether that's they have a certain place in their house where they go, they have a little miniature altar on a table or the desk, or they have a prayer chair, or they light a candle as a piece of it. Again, I think it's what's true to you and what feels right for you. Someone else might want to read something and then you go for a run or a walk and you're just letting the words continue to work on you as you're going through that walk or that run as well.
And I think all of those ways of entering are beautiful, and they may change for us, right? Like, I might need a candle this season, and there might be seasons where I need to read and then run. And I think listening to ourselves too, to say, this practice that I've been doing may not be serving me right now. Maybe there's another one to enter into, and letting it shift as our journey shifts.
Exactly.
All right. So I end all of the interviews with the same question, and I return to the goal of the podcast, which is to empower people to engage politically from a place of hope. And so I'm curious, how are you engaging this election season, and what is giving you hope?
Yeah, it's such a great final question. So I'm engaging this election season in a range of ways. I'm part of a faith community that has a faith and democracy campaign, and we're doing nonpartisan voter outreach, postcards, letter writing, texting, voter protection, making sure that everybody has the right to cast their vote, whoever the candidate is, and that the sanctity of the voting process is honored. But I would also say, and your guests have really helped, listening to other episodes have helped open up the fullness of politics, of political, the shared life together. And one person who's had great influence on me recently is Dr. Greg Carey, who has spoken about Christian nationalism and responding to that. And he instructed us to do two things. One is testify. And I feel like I'm part of the testimony with the postcards and the action and all those kinds of things. Then he also said, and guard your soul. And so I come back to this idea of politics in the fullest sense of it, that I'm also engaging in political work when I run on the trail and I say nature should be preserved. People should have the right to health care and the chance to run in these places, to be reminded of what it is that guards my own soul, and to keep the commitments. In our congregation, we will be feeding people who do day labor jobs because they're going to need to be fed whatever the outcome. Planning a blood drive in November, all of these kinds of things that I would define as political, as well as things like reading novels in addition to poetry and in addition to nonfiction, needing to make space for that fiction reading, knowing that is another practice that can open us up again to empathy, to understanding people whose lives might be very different than ours, but it invites us to come alongside of them as well. And then the shared experience, I would also say, of community. For me, it's a faith community as a primary one, of knowing that there will be people we can gather with every week, whatever is happening, who will, as the call of Scripture says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. But it's not only community there. I am part of a running group on Saturday mornings. I just this fall have started taking improv classes. And it's thinking about these other expressions of community and deeply living into that in this time, because our commitment to community, whether that's online, in person, a knitting group, a book club, I think, again, is part of the doing politics differently that we're all called to claim and reclaim.
I love that so much. I'm part of a modern dance group, and it's not political at all, but thinking of that as this is how we're building the fabric of our community. And so when you go in your running groups, and any chance you have to lean into community and to show up with love and authenticity and strengthen those threads, what a beautiful way of thinking about engagement. Thank you for sharing that with us. I would love for you to close us with a benediction, a final poem. It is on page 24.
Let there be a benediction for right now. Let there be light and gentleness and stuffed animals tucked into beds at night and coffee bought for a stranger and refugees welcomed at airports, and alleluia on your lips when you thought you had finished saying it. Let there be those who study peace, and those who minister without books, those who paint a world not yet seen. Let there be those who take their pain and sing, and those who take their hope and write. Let there be grace so obvious that you must stop to notice it. Let there be those who trade disbelief for daily bread. Let there be all of us, little benedictions blessing something, and not even knowing all the places that blessing travels.
At this election, we see politics as practice, and each conversation is paired with a practice that you can take with you as you heal from and engage the political arena. Laura's offering is her poetry. You can find her closing poem on our Spiritual Practices webpage, and you can purchase her book of poetry, Let There Be Light, through Politics and Prose, DC's premier independent bookstore and cultural hub. Laura also posts poems on Instagram and Facebook at Laura Martin Poetry. Links to these resources can be found in the show notes and on our website at www.thiselection.org/spiritualpractices. This page includes offerings from all of our guests, including a link from the class, which is a practice we explore in episode 3 with JC Gossett. That link gives our listeners a free 30-day subscription to their digital studio. You have been listening to This Election, where we explore the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. Today we heard from Laura Martin. You can connect with her on her website at www.lauramartinpoetry.com. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I would love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram at katie.m.cochran, or you can email me at katie@thiselection.org. Now I have a favor to ask. If you have a minute after the episode, would you mind taking time to leave me a 5-star rating on your listening platform? And if you have 5 minutes, would you leave a review? This has a huge impact on who the podcast can reach, and I know there are a lot of people feeling worn down by politics this season who could benefit from these conversations. I know it's not always easy to find time, but it would mean so much. As you all know, some of my favorite people helped with production of this episode. The beautiful piano you hear at the beginning and end is from Ian Cochran, who wrote and performed the piece with production help from David Cochran. The watercolor painting you see on the podcast artwork was created by my dear friend Kristen Connolly and is available for purchase via her Art for All shop on love.kristen.com. Thank you so much for joining me today. Doing politics differently is not easy, and I'm so grateful for the steps you are taking to heal our politics.